Hello, and thank you for joining our discussion today. Power purchase agreements empowering Florida's private sector to help fight climate change as part of Florida Climate Week presented by the Volo Foundation. My name is Ryan Evans, and I'm the Executive Director of Chambers for Innovation and Clean Energy, a national economic development and public policy group that engages with chambers of commerce, economic development organizations to bring more businesses and right of center voices to the table for clean energy and climate discussions. Prior to joining the CICE team, as we affectionately refer to ourselves, I was the president and CEO of the Utah Solar Energy Association. And prior to that, I spent 13 years as an executive at the Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce, one of the largest chambers of commerce in the country. Today, I am joined by Will Giese from the Solar Energy Industries Association. And Will, if you could take a minute to introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Thanks, Ryan. Yes, my name is Will Giese. I am the current Southeast Regional Director for SEIA, which is the Solar Energy Industries Association, which is the national trade association for solar across the United States. We represent over 1,000 member companies, developers, installers, financiers of solar and storage products. I oversee the Southeast. I'm based here in Richmond, Virginia, but I oversee Virginia, the Carolinas, all the way down to Florida, all the Gulf states except for Texas, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Prior to this job, I was the director of the Hawaii Solar Energy Association, which I worked at for 4 years, doing a variety of different policy work in a bunch of different arenas out there. And I've worked in the private solar industry and on the public and nonprofit side for going on 10 years. Before that, I was a paramedic, so I was doing something completely different. And now currently in my job, I oversee a lot of regulatory and legislative advocacy work, served on an expert witness in regulatory proceedings, and do a whole host of other things to build the solar industry's presence in the Southeast.
Fantastic. Fun thing about Will and I both, obviously, from those bios is we both ran state solar associations. We did not know that ahead of last week, but I guarantee the two of us have lots of fun stories that we will probably explore over the years in terms of those local and state solar fund fights that we have with regulatory agencies and utilities and whatnot. So it was good to know that he shares that background with me. Quickly, before we dive into our discussion of power purchase agreements or PPAs in Florida, I would like to address just a quick comment I heard recently that perhaps we don't need PPAs in Florida now that the Inflation Reduction Act has passed and allows nonprofits, schools, municipal utilities, et cetera, who have historically not benefited from the 30% investment tax credit when installing solar on the rooftops, for example, because now they can actually receive a direct payment of that 30% of the cost of their installed system. And again, we'll explain PPAs and why they're beneficial shortly, because it's our belief that we need every tool in the toolbox when it comes to energy transition and fighting climate change. We think rooftops should not be empty, and large corporate campuses could potentially have ground mount solar panels throughout them. More distributed energy on the grid is a more resilient grid, and we should encourage the private sector to invest its capital in that more resilient grid, not discourage it. So with that quick little bit of level setting, let's start our conversation about PPAs. Will, really quickly, can you just start us off by explaining what exactly a power purchase agreement is and maybe the different types of PPAs out there?
Of course. So, at its base, a power purchase agreement is essentially a financial contract between a seller of power, right, a generator, and a buyer of that power, often called an off-taker or a customer. And it's a time-based contract. Typically, PPA terms are between 10 and 25 years. And what it is that it's a fixed price contract for power generated by an entity and then bought by a consumer. And that's important because often the PPA price that you receive from that generator is hopefully, especially if it comes from like a solar system or renewable energy system, less than what the retail rate would be, or it provides kind of a predictable hedge against variable energy prices over time. For instance, as we've seen since the war in Ukraine started earlier this year, natural gas prices have really fluctuated quite a bit and have affected people's electric bills at the end of the day. And so for especially larger corporate buyers of energy or industrial buyers of energy, a PPA can provide price security over the long term. Now, for PPA arrangements, there's really kind of two overarching types of power purchase agreements for commercial and industrial entities. The first is called a physical PPA, and the other is called a virtual PPA. And the key difference, I think, between these two is where the generating asset is located, right? For a physical PPA, often the generating asset is located on your property, right? So if you own a commercial building, you agree with a developer to enter into a power purchase agreement for the energy that a system would generate. The system is built, owned, and operated by that third entity. And then you host that system on your roof. And then you pay for that electricity in a fixed price. For a virtual PPA, often the system will be built in another place by that developer. That system will feed power directly into the utility at large as kind of part of their generating profile. But then you receive the benefit of that fixed price PPA and help recoup some of the developer's costs in that contract. So those are kind of the two overarching power purchase agreement schemes, or like kind of the way that they're built. And the other thing is, power purchase agreements broadly are essentially one of many different types of tools that off-takers and developers use to build renewable energy. So typically you'll see things like straight cash buys, especially on the retail side, or even some commercial entities will just buy outright a system and host it on their area, or they'll lease a system. This is very common on the residential side, where they pay for hosting an asset, and that asset generates electricity that then you receive credits for. The PPA is different because, again, it is a fixed price for the energy that is pre-negotiated before that asset is built. And so that is just one of the key differences between what a power purchase agreement is versus the other types of financing mechanisms for solar systems.
Excellent, thank you. And obviously we're here to talk about the potential of PPAs in Florida, which means that they are not currently an option or legal in the state of Florida. Where are some of the states typically found that PPAs are commonplace or allowed? Yeah,
so this can get complicated quickly, but typically power purchase agreements are allowed very often in deregulated states, right? So these are states that exist in wholesale energy markets, often have a regional transmission organization. So think of areas like ERCOT in Texas, or MISO around kind of the middle of the United States and the central states. Think of PJM, where I live in Virginia. We're part of a transmission organization that stretches across several states. In California, you have these deregulated energy markets where essentially generators of energy are allowed to compete with each other to provide the best price for consumers. In Florida, and Florida is what's called a regulated market. What I refer to, and lots of folks in the industry, as a regulated monopoly utility in many cases, where you have really only one option to choose for where you get your power from, and it is the regulated utility that is vertically integrated. So it owns both the transmission and distribution of electricity, think the roads, and it also owns the generation. So think the cars that go on the road. And it owns all of them from the top down, and then you buy energy from them. And then the way that those utilities will purchase energy is negotiated and argued for at the regulator. So the Public Service Commission, which is often a state-run agency that regulates those monopolies. So in Florida, because it's not deregulated and because there is no wholesale market, there really just is not a lot of competition among power providers in Florida. On the utility scale side, typically Florida will own and build most of the assets that get built on the grid, right? So these huge solar fields that you see that get built out are places that are often owned by, for instance, Florida Power and Light, which is one of the largest utilities in the state of Florida. They will either build them themselves or they'll hire out to get it built, but they will eventually just own the asset. And there's a few statutory reasons that this exists in Florida that are based on, a specific state statute that kind of protects the ability of the utility to own and operate these assets. But it also kind of prevents third-party competition in the form of power purchase agreements from other kind of potential generators that aren't necessarily the utility from interacting with the market in Florida.
So without necessarily throwing a utility under the bus in any case, but typically the reason why in a regulated market, let me rephrase it this way, but what are a couple of the reasons why utilities don't want to see PPAs in terms of, the assets that they own and or competition? And I know you kind of just said it, but maybe just wrap it up on a little bow in terms of why maybe Florida and Power Light, for example, would not want to see PPA legislation passed in the state of Florida.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest reason, and I think it's understandable from a corporate point of view, if you think about it, is that they don't want more competition, right? They want to be able to kind of determine as many variable factors as they can into a market, right? And often this is the price for electricity. So for Florida Power and Light, for a very long time, they are the generator of choice for most energy customers, most off-takers in the state. And, the way that their business model is organized is such that it assumes that they are often the only power producer, the only generator of record in the state. And so they will do most things to protect that status as their regulated monopoly.
Fantastic. And it feeds right into my next question. Given that model of a monopoly utility, why is it important that we do then consider legalizing PPAs in Florida when all of what you just said, yes, they're protected, they have a regulated framework with which they get to work and it's protected, but yet we're, a capitalist economy, we're a free market economy in the United States of America. Why then, what are some of those principles that if we were to consider legalizing PPAs in Florida, what does that do for the overall market? How would it possibly improve the Florida energy market and Florida economy at a high level?
I was thinking about this, Ryan, after we spoke earlier this week, and I think the best analogy I can give is think of, back in the 90s when you had cable TV, you really only had a couple providers, or you maybe just had one. And they provided, this many channels, but you could really only buy it from them or have public access TV. In a regulated monopoly environment like exists in Florida, you don't even have that kind of public access. You just have the one cable package that you can buy that has that many channels. But then over time, as we saw in the TV and media industry, you had service providers pop up like Netflix, like digital service providers, folks they used to mail you DVDs for things. And you had this pop-up of these different types of services that would provide channels and subscriptions and whatever that created competition in the market, right? And now these days, very few people will buy, cable packages from one cable company that provides them with their internet service or whatever. Often they'll stack different types of subscription services that they get to pick and choose. So for the electricity market, especially one that allow competition, it kind of functions in the same way, right? On one side, you have a competitive market that pushes downward pressure onto prices, right? So every single participant and player in that market is feeding into the demand that exists, and they're trying to hit the best possible price that the market will allow them to buy that power at. And so often those prices will be down, 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 down. And so the consumer is the ultimate beneficiary of those lower competitive prices. In Florida, that competition doesn't exist. So a lot of the times, the only protection that a consumer has typically is the regulator who says, okay, this is what we will allow as a return on investment for any type of generating asset you will sign, or as a power purchase agreement, this is the amount of money that you're allowed to pay up to this amount, right? There is no real competition in Florida. The second kind of big reason that I think it's important is that this competition also produces innovation. So like I said, with the cable company, you did not have these Hulus and Netflixes that were out there creating all these kind of new and interesting shows and experimenting with things and seeing what would work and what didn't. In deregulated markets, you see where you have lots of competition that not only leads to lower prices, but also leads to technology innovation, right? How can these new assets, these solar and storage assets or wind assets or whatever type of renewable energy, how can they interact in the grid other than just providing energy, but also providing some type of service, right? Stability to the grid, resiliency for storms and emergency scenarios, all different kinds of things. In Florida, you really just have one company that's making all the decisions, and utilities, and even utilities executives will say this, is that they make decisions that are very slow moving. They're very used to kind of a stable, slow moving, almost bureaucratic process in the way that which they decide things. They're not used to kind of trying to make the most innovative decision that they can make. And so when you don't have a competitive market, you do kind of stifle some of this innovation. And in the long term, that does sometimes lead to the detriment of those consumers, right? If your system is less resilient to natural disasters, or if it's less able to burden variable natural gas prices because your system is based on like 80, 85, 90% natural gas generation, that's a problem, right? So I think those are kind of the two big pillars of why those types of competitive market products like PPAs are a good thing for the market overall.
Excellent. And on that note too, when you mentioned utility executives and being slow moving, I think one of the important parts also is that they are also very responsive to their shareholders, not necessarily their customers. Yes, their customers are important, so I will never say that they're not. However, they do have that fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. So sometimes their investments are not necessarily what the public wants to see, but what are best for a return on that investment for the utility. And I think it's always good to kind of bring these conversations up just so people understand what utilities have to consider when they're building out their energy plans, what resources, what investments they're going to make. They do have all these different considerations, and a lot of times they do stifle maybe innovation and competition, of course. So thank you.
Well, to that point too, I mean, I think traditionally utilities, and I mean, this is looking kind of historically as an investment mechanism, like utilities are a very safe investment, right? They don't change very often. They have a very stable customer base. They have a regulatory structure that allows them to recover the costs of their assets almost like all the time. There's very little risk in investing in a utility, right? And so there is a lot of fear, I think, and a lot of concern on the utilities part from the investment side on making kind of quick, fast, potentially innovative, cost-saving changes, because it moves them away from that very stable, very risk-averse model that investors that invest in them have historically been very comfortable with. Although one caveat to that is that I've noticed, I mean, in the last 10 years that I've worked in this space, is that there is an acknowledgement by financiers and investors that utilities should be more innovative, right? And I have some examples of that I can get into, but I don't think it is the case as much anymore as it was maybe like in the 1980s or 90s or whenever, that utilities saying low and slow and boring is the best kind of investment choice for investors these days.
Agreed. And just a really fun quote that I've always liked that really emphasizes the point that you just made about the low and slow and risk averse. There's a quote from Warren Buffett out there, and I probably won't get it perfectly, but I think it's still a good enough quote that I can paraphrase it well enough. When he bought his first utility, and of course, Warren Buffett is the owner of Berkshire Hathaway. When he bought his first utility, someone asked him why, and he said, "Well, I didn't buy it to get rich. I bought it to stay rich."
Yeah.
I thought that was just a really relevant comment that forever will be in my wheelhouse of phrases to use. So with that background on PPAs and why they're not currently an option in Florida, why? And you mentioned a couple of these, floating throughout some of the answers, but kind of dig in if you wouldn't mind on why are PPAs such an important tool for corporations in particular who want to procure clean energy as part of their operations.
Yeah, so corporations they're large off-takers of electricity, right? They manage their electricity use in a different way than your average like residential customer, right? Partly because the facilities that they operate are much bigger, they're much more complex. Their energy needs are very different too. So for instance, for a factory, it might be open 24/7. It might always be consuming energy, whereas like at your house, you're using electricity in the morning before you go to work, and you're using less in the middle of the day when you're not at home, and then you're using more in the evening. And your total load profile is what that kind of curve is called, remains the same. But for larger corporate off-takers, maybe they're open all day and they have like a commercial space that's consuming energy at high levels during the day. Maybe they're open 24 hours a day, consuming things and building things and whatnot. And also the way that they do their finances is different too. And so for corporate off-takers of energy, what is really important to them is stability, right? They want to reduce the amount of risk and exposure that they have to a variety of different price fluctuations, whether that be from materials that they're buying for something or utilities, in this case, an electric bill. So a PPA for a corporate off-taker represents a very stable, predictive price path for 10 to 25 years in a contract. Not only that, but often the off-takers can take advantage of certain things that might align with their corporate goals, right? Maybe they have some sustainability goals and they're able to retire renewable energy contracts like RECs, right? Or maybe they're able to take advantage of some tax situations. They take advantage of tax credits and whatnot. Maybe they're a nonprofit and they're looking to reduce their overall operating costs, or at least keep those operating costs very predictable, and they can enter into these power purchase agreements. So there's a lot of reasons that one off-taker might join into a PPA or buy some type of solar system, but often it's about stability to meet their complex energy and financial needs as an entity.
Excellent. And of course, you mentioned this earlier, but typically when a corporation enters into a PPA, often that's going to be the lowest cost option for a bulk of their electrical purchases. So I think that's always a key to remember. And again, that hedge that you mentioned also, I just wanted to kind of build that back in. But when they're signing these PPAs anywhere from 10 to 25 years, it really does get at that notion of them being able to protect themselves from volatile, natural gas prices or whatever may be out there. And then, the other part I think that's interesting is just that PPAs can often be when, especially when a company has emissions reductions goals. So getting back to the climate change conversation a bit, but PPAs can actually be the highest impact option when they're localized, because typically for a company, they've got to pretty much buy the energy that, and especially in a regulated market, that a utility offers up to them. That could be very natural gas heavy. It could be coal heavy. It could be oil heavy. And so by, saying, hey, as a company, we are dedicated to buying this many hundreds of megawatts of solar, they're able to decrease what that option is that's given to them in a regulated market oftentimes, and really impact what their profile looks like as a company overall.
Totally. I mean, to this point, like the Googles and the Amazons of the world have made pretty strong commitments to decarbonize their energy use, right? And so you see massive investments over the last 10 years by those types of companies into renewable energy on their facilities, or entering into virtual PPAs where they don't necessarily have to site things on their facilities, but they can still receive the benefits of that, whether they be environmental or price reduction or whatever. So for them, it's kind of a dual use purpose, right? On one hand, they get price stability and often lower prices because few people enter into PPA contracts if they're paying more for energy than they would otherwise get. But they also are able to meet their corporate environmental goals, whether or not the facility that they're siting in a certain state, whether or not that state has policies in place that line up with their sustainability goals. And, as we've seen in some states, Amazon might move into a certain state and their own environmental goals are much more progressive than the state in which they're building a facility, right? And so these competitive PPAs allow them to still maintain those goals, even though the state itself might not be as far along on the path. So it provides a lot of flexibility. Again, at the beginning, like I said, optionality is important. So these kind of competitive products where you're able to choose what you would like to meet your various needs are monumentally important to you as a consumer.
Yeah, great. And the last one I'll probably throw in this as you were talking made me think that the other advantage for companies with PPAs is they don't necessarily have to invest a ton of upfront capital to procure solar energy. So if they were to develop a massive rooftop system, for example, that's cash intensive right there. However, a long-term contract does not have to be, and allows them to keep that capital in reserve to use for other projects, other priorities, et cetera. So I think that's just another, consideration to throw in here, and a benefit for companies specifically.
Yeah, and two, I mean, they don't necessarily have to pay for, often they don't have to pay for the maintenance or operating costs of that facility, right? They're just receiving the benefit from it. One of the examples too we give at SEIA is that PPAs, it raises the property value of your in a lot of cases will raise the value of your property, which maybe raises your property taxes depending on the statute that exists in the state that you're in. But we've noticed too, at least in the Southeast, there's quite a few property tax exemptions for these types of installations. So your property value goes up, property taxes for that asset is exempted, and you receive the benefits from that system regardless. So you're right too, like companies that may be, depending on where their leverage is at, and might not be able to afford the upfront capital investment of a giant generating asset on their facility, can enter into a power purchase agreement and receive the benefits and pay for it in the long term over a long contract instead.
Excellent. And let's not go down the path of property taxes and solar installations. That's for two solar ones.
It's a whole nother thing.
Our audience, but I've been down that road too many times. So with all of that, can't companies just go out and sign a PPA for energy generated from a utility scale solar farm, for example, in another state, and get their renewable energy credits, the RECs, to offset their energy purchases from their particular utility, which in Florida, as we've talked about, is most likely Florida Power and Light. If that's the case, where they can purchase out-of-state energy, why is it important to still make PPAs an option in Florida?
I'm gonna pause because I'm gonna have to think about how I answer this one. Well, here's what I'll say. There's a few reasons why you would want to have it. First, I think from an overall market perspective, that competition is important in Florida. I think it's good for companies to be able to lower their prices themselves, but it's also good for markets to have more options and to grow. And so if you don't allow this third-party competition in Florida and these states just have to go out of state, what is their incentive to invest in the state that they've already invested some amount of assets in? That's one. And I think it's just important to have that type of competition so that you have more jobs, you have more economic development, and you have more opportunities for these companies that are based in the state to further invest in that state, right? I think that's just good policy to have that. You don't want them going out of state for those types of things. Two, depending on the way that the state is set up, it can be very complicated and administratively burdensome to purchase energy outside of the state in which your facility is located, right? And so for just like total cost might be less over time if you allow for that competition to occur in state, if you allow power purchase agreements to occur there. And so I would say, from a corporate perspective, you would probably want those power purchase agreements to be available in the state that your facility is sited, just for ease of being able to sign them and take benefits of them rather quickly, as opposed to having to go through the rigmarole of trying to find other generators in other states and other agreements.
And one of the angles that I had here, probably when I came up with this question, was thinking into the economics of it. But in the case of Florida, why would you want to push capital out of state and create jobs out of state when the state itself could capture that job creation by building more solar farms in the state of Florida? And then just the idea of even being able to then put some pressure perhaps on Florida Power and Light to decarbonize a little bit better also, because right now they have a decent natural gas in their portfolio. And more solar, more distributed resources just means less need for some of that fossil fuel, and therefore going back to impacting emissions in the state.
Well, I also read too, in Florida, at least for, I believe it's FPL's portfolio, the natural gas that they use to generate their power, it comes from out of state already. So, as a state, why wouldn't you want that power to come from within your state's borders, I guess, even from FPL's perspective? So providing them some competition to try and get, the competition goes both ways. It goes towards those new generators that enter the market, but to your point, it also goes to FPL. Like FPL has existed in a world with very little competition. And so they've had very little incentive to change the way that they've done business, as we've spoken to earlier in this call. So, why wouldn't you want that for them, where all of a sudden maybe they do have a reason to innovate, to change a little bit, to lower their prices, to seek energy that's built in state as opposed to getting it out of state, and to also diversify their portfolio of offerings. Florida is one of the sunniest states in the United States. granted, they have a lot of solar energy, but they have a ton of natural gas. And there's not a lot of natural gas generation within the geographic borders of the state of Florida, I'll tell you. So they have to get it from somewhere else, and that costs them money, and it makes their system less resilient over time.
Yeah, could not have said that better as well. And especially being that Sunshine State, I think it's somewhere around the neighborhood, and I won't get this exactly right, but I want to say Florida solar, I believe, accounts for about 17% total of Florida's energy production. That says a lot for a state that has the resources, has the ability, and yet still they are, like you say, reliant on out-of-state natural gas to a large degree. Yeah. So moving on just a little bit here. Within your offices, I believe, there is another organization called the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance. And in addition to the benefits of PPAs, as we've talked about, how important have companies been overall, kind of in the grand landscape of things, in adding more clean energy to the grid in this country?
So one quick clarification, the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, and I don't know if this is the way you meant to say it, they're not part of SEIA, but they are another organization that we interact with quite frequently, we work with. They're made up of large corporate buyers, off-takers, again, of renewable energy. And they're also an advocacy organization whose focus is to increase the opportunity for these companies to seek renewable energy at the state and federal level, right?
Thank you. And it is what I meant to say. So thank you for, getting me out better on that one.
Yeah, no problem. I just want to make sure that it's mostly to preserve REBA's standing as its own organization, because they're an incredibly effective organization, collection of buyers of renewable energy. And this is important because from my perspective at SEIA, we represent the developers of those types of products, right? We represent the installers, the developers, the financiers of renewable energy, but not necessarily the buyers of that energy, right? So we're on the generator side, we're not on the customer side. And often in conversations, it's sometimes difficult for the customers to have a voice for things. But remember, the Googles and the Amazons and the Walmarts of the world, they are just huge buyers of energy. It's hard to fathom the amount of energy that commercial and industrial facilities consume. And so for them to band together and say, hey, one, the energy that we get from renewable sources is cheaper. And so it's much better for our bottom line to have that. And it makes it better for us to be able to build assets and build things in your state if the amount of money that we're paying for energy isn't going and being sucked up on these massive energy bills that we would consume. Two, we as a collection of organizations have created these sustainable goals that we would like to see enacted at the state and federal level. And we're going to advocate for that. And they do that quite effectively, right? Because at the end of the day, a utility is nothing without its customers. Similar to the solar industry, we would not just be building things just to build them. We build them because people buy the energy that comes out of the assets that we build. And the utility also builds things that's then recovered in a consumer-based rate, right? All of the ratepayers within a utility's consumer base pays for the stuff that the utility builds, right? These corporate off-takers are some of their biggest customers. And so the work that REBA does in collaboration with organizations like myself to get that renewable energy, more progressive, more innovative renewable energy policies done is very important. It's a relatively new player, I would say, in the game. Relatively as in the last 10 years. But so far they've been incredibly effective in some of the things that they've done, like trying to get more open, competitive markets in the Southeast. Trying to get states to change their policies to allow for more commercial and industrial optionality in the way that they buy their energy, try to get the utilities off of their kind of stranglehold of the energy markets that they exist in so that they can have more competition, so that they can buy more renewable energy, so they can buy it at a less cost to them and ultimately pass that savings on, hopefully, to the consumers of products that those companies provide.
Excellent. Yeah. And I can't believe I haven't said this statistic once throughout this entire discussion, but you kind of alluded to it right there. But we've talked about this being a low cost option, but for the sake of an audience that may be watching and listening to this, I think it's really important to note that at present day and for several years now, the lowest form of new energy generation that we can produce in America on a levelized basis is solar and wind. They are cheaper than any other kind of, so if you need new loads of power to serve customers or to serve your growing populations, there's a very good chance that should be coming from renewable energy. In fact, I think it's 90% of all new energy generation over the past few years has been renewable energy. So again, just kind of throw in some of these realistic trends in the market. And then lastly, to this particular question, I read something recently where I want to say close to 40% of all of the new clean energy added to the grid over the last 8 years or 10 years has come via private sector corporations doing big purchase agreements like these power purchase agreements we're talking today, and actually developing their own renewable energy to meet their own goals.
I mean, it's pretty simple to me. If like one thing I understand about business is like you buy low and you sell high. So you buy energy at a low cost and you sell it high, regardless of any other arguably great sustainable or renewable energy goals that your company might have. At the end of the day, like, why would you spend more for electricity when you have an option to spend less? Why would you leave that money on the table? And often you don't, unless you're forced to by some kind of outside power that then you work to advocate to change. And that's what REBA serves that purpose for those consumers to do.
Excellent. We've talked a lot about corporations, and I think the reason we focused on corporations is because of their buying power, because of their influence, because of their history, and because at the very beginning I mentioned with the Inflation Reduction Act, now Florida residents, nonprofits, and schools all have a different mechanism with which to potentially get some incentives to install solar through the IRA. But can PPAs be a benefit to residents in Florida if they were to be legalized? In particular, how can PPAs potentially benefit low and moderate income Florida families?
I mean, it totally can. And this goes back to an earlier point that you made about why PPAs exist in the first place, is because sometimes the folks that are entering into these power purchase agreements are doing so because they don't necessarily have like the liquid capital available for them to buy these projects, right? Although it is true that the IRA will allow nonprofits, and especially nonprofits based in energy communities or low and middle income communities, to take advantage of tax credits to lower the costs it takes to go solar. It will still be the case, unfortunately, that some of these organizations or community areas or whatever, whoever's buying this renewable energy might not have enough to go into straight cash buys or go into financing for these types of things. And thus, a financing mechanism like a PPA, where you don't have to worry about that high upfront cost to build your system, that is of an enormous benefit to these types of organizations that are looking to go solar. So for somebody to say, well, there's no reason for PPAs to exist now that we have these tax credits. I mean, I wish that was the case, that renewable energy was so cheap that these tax credits would just essentially wipe out the cost. But these organizations, especially those that benefit low middle income communities or communities of color, I mean, they are spending the money to benefit those communities. And if they can save some of that money to spend it on the mission that they're doing, but also kind of essentially make more money to be able to spend it on their mission by saving money on their energy costs, they should be able to have some optionality on the way that they choose that, as opposed to like taking that money away from their mission to spend it on reducing their energy costs.
Yeah, agreed. Two quick follow-ups on that. One of the ways that I've seen in other states is through, utility-owned community solar type programs. But the ironic thing is that, a lot of times the utility will make those open and an option for people that maybe live in apartment buildings. They don't have adequate sun on their roof. They may not be able to afford their own system. But the ironic thing is oftentimes those community solar programs are sold at a higher price than what they would typically pay for energy anyway. So they're getting a premium for purchasing clean energy, but that clean energy should actually be cheaper than the regular makeup of the utilities energy portfolio. And then, one other quick just side note on this, the state that I used to live in, which was Utah, we were actually effective and able to get PPAs passed there in a regular market, but only on the residential side. The utility there really did not like the idea of corporate power purchase agreements being an option for companies in the state of Utah, but we were able to actually get it done for on the residential side solely for this low and moderate income option of them being able to hopefully potentially reduce their own electric bills, utility bills on a monthly basis.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was a small shift, bigger shift now to kind of keep this conversation going in some different directions. But we've talked about Florida, the opportunities of PPAs that can bring this particular state. Can you share any examples from other states that have passed PPA legislation and maybe some of the success stories that you've seen come from it?
Man, hold on, because I had an example. This is going to be one of those. I'm glad that we paused. Yes. Okay. So, examples of states that have passed PPA legislation. So, okay. So, a lot of states in the Southeast have looked at legalizing PPAs and have done it in different types of fashions. I'm originally from Arkansas. Arkansas, for a very long time, until about 2019, they really did not have a very robust solar market. They did not have a lot of competition in the forms of power purchase agreements, but a huge bill was passed there in 2019 that did a lot of stuff. It increased it provided more clarity and more stability to the residential solar program, but it also allowed third-party PPAs to be in most places in Arkansas for corporate buyers, for even nonprofits or government entities. And what this has resulted in Arkansas is an energy renaissance, essentially, based on a lot of solar development. I think this did not become more clear to me than it did last year when I think it was an announcement, I want to say in a rural community in Arkansas where the city government and the education department within that government installed so much solar that they were able, under power purchase agreements, that they were able to give every single one of their teachers, I think, a $15,000 raise because they were saving so much money on their electricity costs. And obviously, you know, this isn't a corporate or industrial example, but it is an example that prior to that, I mean, these teachers were making a lot less to, you know, teach all of that community's kids, which is, I think we can all agree, an incredibly important job, and that teachers all should be making much more money than they do. But the fact that they were able to get these massive raises for them just on the reality that the city itself and the Department of Education, the school saved so much money on electricity costs, they were able to take that and put that into teacher salaries, was huge. And so there's examples like this that pop up across Arkansas over the past few years, where you have teacher raises, you have communities saving money and putting it back into parks programs or back into community education programs or whatever. You have places in Bentonville, which is the home of Walmart, where Walmart is installing solar energy on a lot of its facilities, both in the state and in other places, because it just saves them costs and it allows them to take that cost savings and pass it on to consumers. And it wouldn't otherwise have been able to do this if there was no power purchase agreement or competitive market to get, or optionality to get these types of financing contracts. So I think in my head, that's one of the biggest kind of real world examples on how PPAs can be incredibly effective and can just, I mean, the benefits of which are beyond just cost savings and energy. You can take those savings and put them towards something else. In this case, salary increases for all of the teachers in that city.
Well, and talk about, I mean, just what should be the most obvious thing in the world, solar on schools, whether it's a PPA in another state or now maybe that's, you know, school systems can actually utilize the investment tax credit. These schools are open during the day when the sun is shining. It's when all of their energy, you know, usage is happening. Why are we not putting solar panels on top of every single school throughout the entire country for that matter? It makes no sense to me because it's just an easy way to help give teachers raises, put more technology in the hands of students, bring up, you know, educational standards, you know, and goals across the board. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that on there.
Yeah, I mean, not only that, but like in Florida, for instance, schools are this week is more relevant than any other week in that schools often serve as emergency shelters for people in that community, right? And so you want a facility where the lights can come on when you're trying to charge your phone to tell your loved ones that, hey, you know, I made it, I'm safe during a hurricane or any type of natural disaster. So schools are like these multi-purpose facilities that not only teach kids who, you know, should be able to be in an environment that's comfortable. For instance, in Hawaii, a lot of schools were not air conditioned. And so the state passed a huge program to allow those schools to install solar and power air conditioners because the schools were overheating, right? I'm sure that this is the case in some communities in Florida as well. And it does strike me as, you know, unfortunate that it isn't the case that a lot of these schools are installing this cost savings measure for them, because at the end of the day, that's what it is. In Florida, it is the reason that because there isn't optionality in how these schools can go about choosing these types of energy options, because there are no power purchase agreements, they're unable to make that choice for their students in a lot of cases. And, you know, the people who suffer from that are not utility executives. They are kids and students and teachers and staff in those who work in those schools and work in those communities, right? So I agree with you, and you've seen too in the Southeast, like in nearby Mississippi, they're going through their net metering program, and part of it has this pretty innovative Solar for Schools program that allows for essentially like kind of an agreement between the utilities and regulated by the Public Service Commission to allow developers to install solar on schools, which is a great thing. And we should see that in more states, no more so than places like Florida.
Agreed. When I mentioned to a colleague we were going to be recording this session and talking about power purchase agreements, she reminded me of West Virginia being another regulated electric market that has also now allowed PPAs. For a long time, they were not. But I think West Virginia found themselves as a very fossil fuel friendly state. I mean, that was the bulk of their economy for, you know, it has been the bulk of their economy for generations at this point. And I think they started, you know, kind of the backstory is I think West Virginia started to see some of the writing on the wall that you know, companies were looking to add more. They saw this energy transition happening. They saw the price points of solar and wind coming down, and they made the conscious shift, I think, within that state to become, at least as far as the policymakers go, is to be an all of the above state. And, you know, at our organization, we obviously advocate for clean energy. We don't push back on non-clean energy, but it's also because our belief is the economics of clean energy are going to win the day anyway. And our whole, you know, we're already moving towards clean as it is. We're just going to continue. But for a state like West Virginia to say, hey, we've been this type of a state, an oil and gas and coal state for so long, maybe we really ought to look at our options for renewable energy. And a couple really quick things that I want to throw in just for the sake of this conversation about the power of corporations. But Nucor Steel was looking to build out a new facility, and they were shopping it around a couple different states, and two of the states they were finalized on were Ohio and West Virginia. Ohio blew it when Nucor said, hey, one of our main priorities is we need to have the ability to procure renewable energy. Specifically, we like solar. What are our options in the state of Ohio? And whoever was on that particular day that was meeting with Nucor gave the answer of, well, I'm not sure, but we do have renewable natural gas. And needless to say, Nucor did not choose Ohio, whereas West Virginia widely opened their doors and said, you can actually, yeah, of course you can build out a solar utility scale solar farm, do it through a power purchase agreement. That ended up when Nucor chose West Virginia as being the single largest private sector capital investment in the history of West Virginia. And then recently, she also, my colleague, emailed me a couple quotes that I just have to share, but they're so good. So their Secretary of Economic Development in West Virginia, these are two quotes. One was attributed to him, one is a direct quote, but the first is, Carmichael said nearly 100% of the major corporations he is now attempting to recruit to West Virginia want renewable energy in their potential site plan. That is huge. And again, yeah. West Virginia. And then the second one that is a direct quote, we also want to be, quote, all of the above energy state. If you want to locate a renewable facility here, then you are welcome. And I feel like that is just such a great forward progressive answer from a state. Again, they're an energy state, but to say, you know what, we're opening our doors, we want this, and we need this capital investment for our communities.
Talk about writing on the wall. I mean, to our conversation earlier about why would companies want PPAs to be local as opposed to if they can just go out of state and get them and keep their facility in state. You don't want them to leave. Because you know what? When those companies leave your state, when they leave Florida, they're taking their jobs with them, right? And and why would you want to be? I mean, this is the thing that gets me about renewable energy in general, and that it's truly like it's not an ideological thing. There's a business case for it, there's a social case for it, there's an environmental case for it. There are a few cases against it. And I think it just depends on like what case you want to make and where you're at. You can usually make that case for renewable energy. West Virginia, like the coal capital of the world, is saying, hey, we want more solar and we want it now. And that's how we're going to get businesses to come to our state and build things. Do you need anything else? Like, do you need other reasons? I don't.
If West Virginia can do it, I'm pretty sure Florida can figure it out too. Call me crazy.
Yeah, I think so.
And before I get to my final question, because we're getting close to the end here, and this one may seem really obvious, but I want to spend just a couple minutes on it at least, but especially given the context of this conversation, but how important is clean energy to fighting climate change? And the second part of that, despite what some claim, can we truly at some point get to a grid where 100% of the energy generated is via clean energy?
Oh, yeah, well, that second point is a foregone conclusion to me. So yes, I think you can. I mean, I think for me, having worked in this industry for a while and understanding both sides of it, the real questions about how the grid functions at 100% renewable energy really come about when you hit like that 80 and 90% mark. And everything before that, I think, is like, it's really getting to the end on where those really important questions come in about things like fast frequency response and kind of more complex kind of grid operating questions. But do I think it's possible with solar and wind and hydro and storage? Yes, I do. And I wouldn't be working in this industry if I didn't think that was the case. As far as like the climate change portion of this conversation, you know, we are not in a situation in the world where we can afford to burn more coal, more fuel oil, and more natural gas. I mean, I don't know how many climate examples people need, whether it be flooding, whether it be huge storms, whether it be massive drought, whether it be the fact that like the West Coast is essentially on fire 365 days a year, whether it be that when I lived in Hawaii for 7 years, the properties on the beachfront in Hawaii were like a lot of them were no longer around anymore because sea level rising is happening. And it's for me, it is not a question of science anymore. It's a question of like, just look with your eyes and see what's happening in the world, right? And sure, there's lots of ways to decarbonize. I think the transportation sector, there's a huge question about how we're going to get off of our dependence on oil to fly planes and move cars and things like that. It's a huge question, and I don't have a lot of answers for that. The energy sector is the other big elephant in the room. And for me and my kids and my kids' kids, I don't think I can afford to say we should build another coal power plant or we should build another natural gas power plant and release more carbon and more methane and more natural gas or more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that are continuing to hurt this planet. I mean, one thing that I'll say is that, like, I studied climate change as part of my education, and the striking thing to me about it is that, like, in the long term, the world doesn't really care how the climate changes, but the people that live in it have to care. And the world's going to exist long after we're all gone. But why would you ever make a decision that makes the world that your kids live in or that their kids live in worse than it is the one that you're living in right now? And for me, things like renewable energy, that is the decision that I need to make, however I need to make it.
Yep, couldn't agree more. I think it's a to me, I chuckle a little bit when people do say we can't get to that full 100% clean energy grid when the amount of innovation and price decreases we've seen in renewable energy over the last 10 years alone has been astronomical. You know, the technology is getting better, it's more efficient, it's cheaper. All of it just goes to a very realistic, you know, picture of this is very possible, especially when you add in the innovation happening in the energy storage sector in particular. So, you know, quick little detour on that, but I think it's really important to stress that if we are innovating as fast as we are and prices are continuing to decrease, there's no reason we cannot hit what we want to hit and see happen, which is a fully, you know, 100% clean energy grid of the future. How long it will take to get there, I don't know. And what are the last, you know, what does that last, you know, 80 to 20, you know, or 10 to 20% look like? I don't know. I don't even know if we're there yet, but we're going to be there. I have no doubt in my mind we are going to be there. We'll figure that last mile out, so to speak.
Yeah, and I mean, the choice becomes, is it worth it to do this or is it not? And I just don't see a reality in which it's not worth it to try, even if we don't yet know how it's going to happen. I mean, I believe in human innovation. It is a condition of our species to innovate and become better. And that is a problem that is surmountable for us, for sure. And I remember I sat in this technical conference years ago. This utility had this kind of corporate-y looking slide, and it had, like, you know, in the 1900s, everybody had a horse-drawn carriage, and nobody could like conceive of automobiles being in the roads everywhere. It's just never going to happen. Or, you know, nobody can conceive of an aircraft that could take people to and from in a plane or whatever. Nobody could conceive of a bunch of electric power lines going all over the place, powering homes where you're not having to like light a candle every night and walk around. I mean, for us to say, well, it's never going to happen for 100% renewable energy grid. I mean, look at human history. It's absurd to say something like that, in my opinion. Just because we haven't figured it out doesn't mean it's not yet possible. And I guarantee you that the problem of figuring out 100% renewable energy grid is a much easier problem to fix than figuring out how we're going to live in a planet that is flooded and constantly on fire at the same time.
Thank you. That may be one of the best answers I've ever heard. I love that. Yeah, I'll gladly take on this challenge and not want to deal with the other one as it's happening, you know, worse than it already is in many, many ways. So yeah, amen. Okay, so last question, kind of a call to action here, but Will, with you know, those that have been sitting in, listening in on this conversation to, you know, advance PPAs in the state of Florida, what can they do to help this cause in terms of, you know, helping to make sure that we do have PPAs, more optionality in the future for Florida, whether it's specifically for corporations or just PPAs in general?
Yeah, for me, it's use your voice. You know, like I cannot be the only person out there advocating for this, and I guarantee you that I am not. So y'all are buyers, you're builders, you create jobs. I mean, I have an easy job. All I have to do is kind of say, this is kind of my opinion about things, and this is how it is. And, you know, I work for a relatively small organization, but you're the job creators, which means that not only do you have a voice, but all of your employees have a voice. You're the ones that build things, right? And so you should have some agency over, you know, what it is you want to build and the kind of future that you want to build into. And hopefully that would include renewable energy. And you should tell people, whether it be council people in the area that you're citing a new facility, whether it be a representative or senator, whether it be a congressperson, a mayor, the governor, policymakers, whatever, you should say, this is what we want and this is how we want it. This should not be your only education on how PPAs work. I'm far from like an expert on the intimate details of how a power purchase agreement comes about. So for me, this should be the springboard for you all to say, hey, I'm interested in that. I want to know why this isn't the case in Florida. And I want to make it so it is the case, right? I want to go to policymakers during legislative sessions. I want to go to the regulator. I want to go to my city and county and say, this is what we want. This is how you're going to get our business. This is how you're going to change our community. This is one of the many things that would make that catalyst for change. So for me, it's just, you know, use your power the way that you have it. to effectuate the change that you want to see. And in my mind, hopefully that change includes renewable energy. And yeah, PPAs are super boring, but they're part of that transformation. And it's an important thing to have.
Certainly. I mean, they're super important and they are super boring. But they're a really good conversation to have because people need to understand really why they can be beneficial. And one of the things that I would just throw on here really quick, from my history and working in terms of getting people to advocate for things, but environmental and climate concerns are always relevant and important. But a lot of times, especially in a state like Florida, the business case for renewable energy is going to be the one that wins the day. And I think that, as as people listening, as you reach out to policymakers, your local, city council members, your state legislators, whoever they may be, remind them that renewable energy is cheap. And yet in the state of Florida, we're looking at rate increases from Florida Power and Light on a regular basis. Shouldn't we be fighting that with every possible to make electricity affordable for Floridians and more resilient? And so I always just try to remind people that yes, there are feel good reasons, and yet there are reasons sometimes that actually move people faster and easier when it comes down to that return on investment and the business case for something. And in this case, I think there is an enormous upside to the business case for power purchase agreements, especially when it comes to PPAs for corporations in Florida.
Totally agree.
Excellent. Well, I want to say thank you very much for joining me in this discussion today. It's been a really good conversation about PPAs, in my opinion. I hope people have learned something. And if you are interested in learning more, please feel free to reach out to either Will or I. We can certainly talk you through any questions you may have offline. And I would also like to thank the Volo Foundation for hosting and organizing Florida Climate Week. Really important to have this type of dialogue and programming to help people understand not only the situation, but really what the options are in terms of taking climate action. So to the Volo Foundation, I say thank you very much. And once again, Will, thank you to you, and thank you to all those that have listened and watched today. So thank you much.
Thank you.